So tonight I'm going to talk about a few different things. One, what I learned translating the Quran and putting it into English, what I learned about Islam doing that. But I really want you to get a sense for what I learned going around the country talking. For about 2.5 years now, I've been wandering around this country talking to folks. And it's been fascinating for me as someone who's spent my career working on the Middle East and living in Muslim cultures to see what America knows and what they don't know and how they feel about Islam and trying to explain that to them. But also talking to the press a lot and talking with folks in this administration and talking with the government. So I'll hit all those issues. So I'm not going to dig real deep into some of the slides. I'm going to just tell you what I learned talking about it. This is the main point I try to get across to every audience when I talk to them. So if you've heard me talk about this before, this won't be a newsflash to you. So 3 big buckets there. Islam in green, a religion, just like every other religion, a belief system. Do's and don'ts, how to live your life, what the hereafter is like. Islamism, that term, that ism on the end. Think capitalism, socialism, communism. It's a political ideology. That's a man-made thing. You use Islam as a basis for part of it, but it is how men think about it. What Islamism means in action in a government, think of what Iran is like. The religious leader is also the political leader. He controls everything you do, and he does it based on religion. So you can arrest somebody for not wearing a scarf on their head. That wouldn't go over too well in America. So that's what Islamism is. And then I put in quotation marks ISIS, because they're just the latest terrorist group that everybody knows the name of. But their ideas are a violent, radical form of Islamism. They want that governance system, and they're willing to kill you to get there. And they don't care who you are. If you don't believe in exactly what they believe, they will kill you. That's the bottom line. And every group that's been like ISIS that comes and goes has that same belief system. So we're talking about an ideology here. That's the key word to take away from this. A friend of mine who's a religious scholar, works in D.C., we had a lot of emails going back and forth when I was translating the Quran. I was trying to explain, how do I tell the American people what Islam is as a religion? And he said, well, get away from the myth that people try to throw out that Islam is a religion of peace. He said, it's just a religion. I've grown up Muslim. It's not a religion of peace. It's not one of war. Those are decisions made by men. Men decide war and peace, not religions. Religions are belief systems. So just start with that. So put your head in that place tonight. For talking about this for 2.5 years, these are some of the wonderful things I've been called. Because the first thing I learned about talking about a religion, if you don't speak about it exactly the way the audience wants to hear it, they don't like you. So these are some things I've been called from the left and the right, from Muslim, from non-Muslim. And it's disturbing. The big takeaway I think I leave you guys with, you're going to take heat in your life when you talk about subjects. I use facts, which is kind of crazy in this time and day and age in America. So you're going to make people angry. But censorship is also not the answer. You'll hear a lot of people in your life as you go through life say, we should just silence those people if we don't want to hear what they have to say. That's not a good step either. That does not lead to any solution. No problem gets solved if you don't talk about it. And that's all I'm doing is talking about an issue that's going on that people have questions about. So you just have to push all that stuff aside. These are the questions I've been asked, though. And these were the ones that came to me time and time again when I met with audiences. Did you convert to Islam? Everybody wants to know if I'm a Muslim. That's like question number 1. We usually don't talk about people's religious faith in America. People have no problem asking you that question if you stand up and talk about Islam. And then if I tell them I'm Christian, they ask me to prove it. What church do you go to? How long have you been there? I mean, I've been grilled at some backwoods Methodist spots about this topic, so it gets kind of weird. Who are the good Muslims? Okay, I always ask, well, who are the good Christians? Like, is there a mark or something? I don't know how that works, but how do you tell if they're good or not? And these come up time and again. I mean, I've talked to dozens and dozens of audiences, from Michigan to Tennessee, up and down the East Coast. These are the things I get. Why don't more Muslims speak out against terrorism? That's a really tough one for Muslims to do. And if you've never thought about it, imagine being under a microscope where you're persecuted. And every time you speak about a topic, someone's going to yell at you. I know what this feels like because I've been doing it for a couple of years now. But for Muslims, they always come up to me afterwards and say, thank you for what you're doing. You're talking about this, and people are listening to you. When I stand up as a Muslim and talk about this, I get hate mail from everybody. I get conservative Muslims who don't want me to talk about it because they think I'm doing something wrong against my own religion. And then I get attacked from everybody else who's not a Muslim that I'm lying to them. I must be trying to deceive them. So they're in a tough spot. Just be aware of that. You'll hear that concern. Just be aware of that. Those are some of the big ones. The last one is always something that comes up to you. Make sure you go talk to Trump. So they're always amazed when I tell them I actually did get to go talk to the new administration, and they took some of these ideas with them and changed the way they're talking. So we'll get to that to the end. What Muslims have told me. Almost every talk I go to, somebody comes up to me afterwards that I didn't know was in the audience. Sometimes I can spot them, and because they'll be giving me different signals as I talk. But they always come up and say thanks. Most are surprised that I'm not talking about this. If you're not a Muslim, why are you talking about it? Why are you trying to help? You know, I was a soldier for 23 years. I really don't like war. I have too many friends in Arlington. I don't want any more there. So the more we can talk about issues instead of shoot about issues is a good thing for me. Many have told me that it's a thought-provoking way to talk about it. And they want that kind of honesty. So believe me, you'll get hate when you talk in life, but there's also a lot of people that are appreciative that you're speaking about an issue. This is always an interesting one. I throw this pop quiz out everywhere I go. What percentage of these people are terrorists and what percentage are American patriots? There's an easy answer. This is usually how this question goes. You got something. What are you thinking?
100% American patriots.
Nope.
50-50?
50-50. That is actually true, but there's an easier answer.
They're just names.
They're just names. They're first names. There's no way to tell who's who. They're just first names. If it said Tom, Dick, and Harry, you wouldn't know if they're good people, bad people, patriots. They're just names. I made the list, so I happen to know who they are. 5 of them are some of the worst terrorists we've ever hunted, and 5 of them are good friends of mine. One of those is a Navy pilot who also works with intelligence and the DEA, and he earned the Medal for Valor on the ground in Afghanistan. So I use this just to help people understand you never want to judge a book by its cover, right? It's just a name. It may sound Muslim, it may sound Arabic, it may sound Persian. It's just somebody's first name. Start from there. Interesting fact. I'm not sure how much you guys keep up on the populations of the world. About 2012, when we did a good census, Christianity was the largest religion in the world. How long do you think that's going to last? Any guesses? What year is that going to change?
2040.
Pretty close. More. Well, I'll show you a slide to show you what the numbers are going to look like. The non-religious number actually stuck out to me even more. That number is climbing faster than any religious number. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. How quickly, the top 2 are going to switch here in a couple decades. But how quickly is that third place one going to pop up? Because there's a lot of changes going on, especially with the younger audiences, and you guys probably have these discussions as well. So by 2060, that should flip, mostly through birth rates. When you're talking in the millions of people, that 2.9% versus 2.6%, that's a lot of people. So it's going to flip by about 2060. You'll see that in your lifetime. What do you think that map's telling you? Any guesses? No, it's not a religious map. Terrorism? Those are terrorism strikes. The last 45 years. Do you think there are a lot of Muslim people down in Colombia and Peru? No. I try to make sure people understand you cannot tie a religion to a terrorist activity. This is the last 45 years. If you only went back 30 years, a lot more of that's going to shift the Middle East. Because modern terrorism does have a lot of Islamist inspiration, so you're going to find it in more of the Muslim pockets of the world. But that's the shining path in the FARC down in South America too. So if you've ever thought you should tie religion to the act of terrorism, untie that in your mind. Okay, it happens. There are a lot of different reasons people do terrorism. Now this is what people call the Muslim world. It doesn't really exist. It's not really a place. But if you want to look where most Muslims live in the world, those are the countries that have 50% or more Muslim population. What do you think the dark green spot is in the middle? Maybe some of you can read it. That's where Shia Muslims live. That's the smaller part of this, large religion. About 15% are Shia. So kind of surrounded by Sunni states. That goes to some of the background in their thinking. And we said it's going to flip in the next couple of decades. Those yellow areas are 10% Muslim right now. So that's where you're going to see the largest growth. And it's really pushing south in Africa and along the coast there. So that's where you're going to see the largest increases, and again, mostly through population. If you've never read ISIS strategy, you should understand what they think. This is how they view the world. This is what they want to do to the world. Some of you are reading that for the first time, probably. That's how ISIS views the world. This is their vision. That's that violent Islamist view. For them, they think they're the best Muslims in the world. Most Muslims think they're not Muslims at all. But this is how they see the world. And this is how the Taliban saw the world. This is how Al-Qaeda sees the world. This is the mindset. This is the ideology that they cling to. In 2016, that's where ISIS had strongholds. Those three big areas in Syria and Iraq. This is the end of last year. Those little red spots. That's all they have left. Their army on the ground has just been wiped out. But now they're down to an insurgency-sized element. Do you think we killed the ideology of ISIS? This is what they wanted to do. That green spot, when they said they want to reform a caliphate, that's where they want to get to. Those borders from Spain to India. That's what they want to rebuild. That's about the year 750. That's what they want to roll back the clock to. That's about how far they spread out their flags by 2016. In just a couple of years. They were pretty much all the way to Spain and almost to India, but this time they went farther down into Africa and they shot out into the Pacific, into some of those larger nations with large Muslim populations. So ISIS did get to rebuild a lot of what it wanted to, this virtual caliphate. So where do you think that picture is? Those are kids, probably 8-year-olds at an ISIS school, learning that strategy that you read. That's what those kids were being taught.
Indonesia.
Is that Iraq, Syria?
Indonesia.
Close.
Philippines.
In that neck of the woods. That's Malaysia. So ISIS is really, unfortunately, franchised quite a bit. We're going to have problems in a lot of countries afterwards because you can shoot all the terrorists you want to shoot, but you can't shoot an ideology. You have to talk about it. You have to counter that with better arguments. You have to explain facts. You have to have some truth out there for people to cling to. You think those guys in ISIS are really smart religious scholars? They're not. That's why they're there. They're not on it. So this is about talking about that. Okay, what I learned talking about Islam, what I learned translating the Quran. These are some of the big key terms that I try to teach people. Islam 101. If you want to come back tomorrow evening, we'll go in depth on this and talk about counterterrorism a lot deeper. But I'll give you a few of the big ones to take away here. There's two big sects inside of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. But when that split happened, there was a third sect that most of you probably never heard of. They were called the Khawarij. These were the first terrorists in the world, in this part of the world. All right? They split from them. They walked away from the Sunni and the Shia when that divide happened. And they said, if you don't think exactly like we do, we will kill you because we are the most pious Muslims in the world. So if you're not like we are, we get to kill you on sight. And they started terrorizing the Middle East. And the Sunni and Shia combined forces to hunt them down and kill them because they realized that they couldn't live with a group of people thinking that way, using that ISIS-style strategy. That same ideology has stood around at the test of time, unfortunately. So that's what we're talking about when we want to counter that ideology. So what's in the Quran? Has anybody read it? Front to back. Read the book. Okay. I don't know what you think is in the Quran. There's about 114 chapters, over 6,000 verses. It took about 23 years for it to be recited. It was all done orally. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, couldn't read or write. So this is him reciting these revelations from God. And they were put together about 20 years after he died. It was put together in a book format. I interpreted it into a chronological version because they're not chronological. The story doesn't run from year 0 to 23. The chapters are all mixed up, so it's kind of tough to get your head around. So I put them in order from year 0 to 23, makes it easier. Put it in modern English, and I took out all the extra things that get added to a Quran, and I'll talk about that in a second. These are the big topics in the Quran. It's a religious text. Creation, how to live, the commandments. What are the end of times like? What's Judgment Day going to be like? What's the hereafter like? These are the stars of the story. These are the people that come up time and time again. Has anybody ever heard of these folks before? There's a bunch of new people. So you probably know some of these stories. I know more about Moses and Pharaoh now from translating the Quran than I ever learned in Baptist Bible study. So these are a lot of stories you already know. When you read it, you'll be surprised to see. These are the big messages in the Quran. Forgiveness, one of the most popular messages in the Quran. The idea of forgiveness, that God is forgiving and that human beings should be forgiving. That is one that goes over the head of most people. The oneness of God, the rewards for heaven, punishments for hell. Again, if you've ever read any kind of religious text, you probably have heard of these concepts. And in the end, that conduct of warfare and diplomacy. There's a war that takes place in the middle of these recitations, and then there's the diplomacy afterwards when they reconcile. If you put it into a cool chart, you see what pops up. Those are the big key words inside the Quran. Moses pops up in there. I thought it was interesting. His name comes up more than almost any other word. If you put it in a pie chart, most of the book is about God. Who knew? And then it gets into good and evil, heaven and hell. Those are the main topics of the book. There are controversial verses. And if you want to use these verses in modern times, they're pretty easy to use if you take them out of context and you're talking to somebody that doesn't understand religion. These do exist in the Quran. And that's the thing that makes it easy for groups like ISIS to recruit. They use this in their propaganda. You should strike people in the neck. You've probably seen a lot of beheadings from ISIS. That's where they get this idea from. That God will take care of you if you die in God's way. That's another popular recruiting story. If you come and fight for us, you're going to go to heaven and get all the rewards. You probably heard some of the myths about the rewards you're going to get in heaven. And the last one there is that Khawarij ideology that I mentioned. You can judge somebody else to see if they're Muslim enough for you. And that's the idea that ISIS uses a lot. That's how they take over villages and start killing all the men, enslaving all the women, and taking the children. So they use these words. They can find them in there, right? There's also things like this in the Quran, which most people don't know about. Think, this is the 600s. This is Vikings wandering around the world, right? Marauding. These are things that show up in the Quran in the 600s. A little bit ahead of its time. That women should be able to inherit. When did women start inheriting property in America? All right, who teaches history? It wasn't in the 600s. Let's just say. So if you think about it, these things popping up in a religious text in the 600s, this is pretty earth-shattering. This was a surprise to a lot of people. So it made it a little bit easier. You didn't have to spread this religion by the sword, which is the popular myth. These were not hard ideas to sell somebody that had a pretty bad life in the 600s. This is good news for a lot of people. So it's interesting to hear. The inheritance stuff, it really sounds like a lawyer wrote it down. It is very clear what inheritance will be like for women. People often ask me what are my favorite verses, and those are some of the ones that jump out at me when I was translating. They really spoke to me, and I think to a lot of people, and a lot of my Muslim friends who explain these things to me. That choosing to forgive is one of the most rewarding things you can do when you're angry. We could probably all use a little bit of that. That God will reward anybody who reconciles, and the most courageous thing you can do is to be patient and forgive. Things you probably haven't heard of before. I mentioned that things get added. Why did I put the Quran into modern English and take out a lot of the footnotes and all the things that get added? Because authors will put these into different languages. Do most Muslims in the world speak Arabic? No. That's a very small population of the world that speaks Arabic. So most of them have to get it in another language. They're going to read it in English. They're going to read it in some language that's spoken in Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world. So when they do that translation, when they interpret it, a lot of people take license to add things to it. So that is part of this counter-messaging thing. You've got to find out what gets inserted in some of these books, because that's all people know. They can't read the Arabic. They're never going to see it in any other version. They put in things, some pretty disturbing things. There are comments in there that denigrate certain religions. There's whole appendixes that are in the backs of some of the Saudi Qurans that say Christianity is a false religion. 40 pages describing how rich European men are propping up a religion that's false. That's not in the Arabic version. That doesn't exist. This is what people stick in there. So there's kind of a battle there to keep an eye on who's putting what into it and making sure that's changed. So what's ISIS doing today? Like I said, we've about beat that army down in Iraq and Syria, but the insurgency is just starting. They're also popping up in Libya, which we had a change of government around 2011. That's going to be a hot spot. Keep an eye on it. And there's a lot of different franchises. And we don't know where they're going to pop up next and what they'll call them next. This is the king of Jordan. He's starting to use this language. Language that I've been talking about for a couple of years now. We're starting to see it used on the international stage. He was using it long before I was, because this word exists in Islamic history. People know what this means in the Middle East. Folks like ISIS are outsiders, they're outlaws, they've left Islam. And that's the kind of language we need to use, very precise. You're speaking about it in a way that people can understand. You've got to segregate folks that are in ISIS away from society. Prime Minister in the UK, Islamist extremism, not Islam, not Islamic, Islamist, using the right words. And this is our new national security strategy for the United States. And that language is much different than what happened on the campaign trail from both parties. It says in that top line there that we have radical Islamist terrorist groups. Islamists, not Muslims, not Islamic. Nowhere in there does it say anything about Islam or Muslims. That has been removed from the language. We're trying to be clear about that, get that straight. And there's the second part talks about the ideology, and that it's twisted and wicked, and you've got to talk about the ideology. So that is happening on an international scale now. We're having this discussion using exact words. It makes it a little bit easier. So if you want to talk more about this, we'll meet up tomorrow. And for the rest of this, I'll take your questions, comments, ideas, thoughts. The floor is yours. Yes.
If you believe in being able to confront people about problems, how do you deal with the over-politically correctness that's in America? And about people being overly politically correct and trying to harm people by their words?
Yeah, that is the tough part of this whole. You know, how far can you go with honesty? You know, at some point, anything you say is going to be offensive to somebody else. That is a valuable lesson to start learning. If you're here and you're thinking about it, that's good. Because this makes this really hard. By talking about Islamism as a political ideology, there are groups in America who claim to speak for large groups of Muslims who will say, no, we don't want you to use that word either. Even though they know exactly what it means and is separating it from the religion of Islam, they don't want that word used either. So they want you to be imprecise. But that makes it hard. Your allies don't know what you're talking about when you're imprecise. You guys have probably learned by now that precise language is important. People need to know exactly what you mean, and people have got to get to a point where they can't mistake what you're trying to say as well. So this is the challenge. You've got to find that balancing point, and I think education goes a long way with that. Does that help at all? Awesome. Anybody else? Thoughts, ideas? Sure.
Can you speak to how reminiscent, in your opinion, the Shia-Sunni schism is, or the problem is, to the Protestant Catholic schism of old in Christianity?
So the Sunni-Shia split. I didn't go too much into what those two mean. Sometimes it's hard with the younger crowd. Most people know a little bit about the Catholic faith and the Protestant faith. We use some of those analogies. So the Shia side of things is a little more like the Catholic view in Christianity. There's a hierarchy of religious scholars leading up to a grand ayatollah, pope, if you want to call it that. But there's more than one in Shia, so you pick your pope. You get to follow the one that your family and your mosque follows. On the Sunni side, it's a little more Protestant-like. I grew up Protestant in America. It's you, Jesus, and God, right? So there's no one in between. You don't go to anybody and get a religious opinion from anybody. You've got a direct line. So in rough terms, the big difference between the two. A lot of things that you hear in the world that are supposedly Sunni and Shia splits, it's really political. It's not religious. There's very little difference between Islam, to somebody who's Shia and somebody who's Sunni. They both use the same Quran. No difference. They follow the same commandments. There's just some different things in how they interact with other people and how they interact with each other and how they view each other. So it is very similar in that way to Christianity and Protestants and Catholics. But most of the issues are political. It's about, say Saudi Arabia, who's mostly Sunni, almost majority Sunni, and Iran have issues. People will paint that as a Sunni-Shia split, but it's really that those two countries politically don't get along, and they don't like each other, and they have issues with each other in a lot of different ways. So it's not a huge religious burden unless you're a real extremist on one side or the other, just like in most religions in the world, until you get out to the far extremes. Most people in the middle, they couldn't tell you what the difference is between a Sunni and a Shia on any given day. It's just not that easy to spot unless you've grown up in one side of the family and you're married into the other. But there's intermarriage, so that happens. Does to help out a little bit? Yes?
So you mentioned that, like, the ideology doesn't die because you take representation of people from certain areas, and then you showed the picture of the children who are in schools and all of this. What steps, like, you mentioned what issues in regards to this? What steps have to be taken, or what steps do you think will need to be taken to either prevent this or in the future to sort of stop it, or do you think this is just going to be a new cycle?
So some of those steps are already in place. If you go back and read President Trump's speech in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the first foreign visit he did, he went to the Middle East, and he gave a speech, and he talked about that exact issue, that the way people talk about Islam has to be on the table. You've got to find out if somebody's in a mosque or a religious institution and they are spreading a violent view of Islam and a violent ideology, you've got to be able to talk about that and point it out. Nobody said you need to censor them, but you need to have that debate and pull them out and shine a light on them. So that's part of that education process and rethink it. And Saudi Arabia, under the last administration, already started talking about this idea. In 2016 or 2015, I heard a Saudi minister stand on a public stage in D.C. and say, you know, we have got to think about how we talk about Islam. We may need to change that. I don't think we're helping this discussion, because that's one of those countries that really pushes out some pretty extreme views on Islam. So it's really getting everybody to admit there's a problem, that we need to have this discussion, and then start having that discussion, shine a light on anybody who's putting out a more violent view about the religion, wherever they are, whether they're in the media or in schools and religious settings, and really shining a light on it, pulling out any funding they're getting. So that's happening right now. There's a new center that stood up in the Middle East that is focused on that. They're really looking to make sure that people are having positive messages, and if they're doing things that are negative or going to cause problems or violence, then they want to shine a light on it and point that out and try to stop it. Yep.
I've been told blanket statements about how Islam is just oppressive, it's not good for women. But once you present it to us, it makes it look like it is very good. Is that like a confusion with Islamism as a political ideology versus the religion itself?
There are a lot of, again, this comes down to interpretations. I put an asterisk on that slide. In my classes, I go in depth about what those mean. One of the things that that slide also said is that women must act honorably and men must act honorably towards them, kind of protect their honor, and that men are responsible for protecting women, which in the 600s, that would have been a big step forward. Hey, if you see a woman being abused, as a man, you have to stand up for her. But you can misuse that as well. You can also point at the Quran and say, well, it says I have to protect you. So in places like Saudi Arabia, they can say as a government to their people, women can't go anywhere without a male guardian with them present at all times. And now women are dependent on a man being with them if they want to go grocery shopping. If you've ever seen that happen in real life, it's odd to see a mother waiting for her son to come be her guardian so she can go do something. It just turns it on your head. You really can't concept it. So there are ways to interpret that to your advantage. If you're a male-based society and you want to make sure you're repressing women and getting your way, you can do that too. Again, it goes to education, how you're really interpreting it. Do you believe in equal rights? Where do you stand on it as a government? And those are conversations that are happening now. Social media is helping that conversation. Women can go on Twitter and talk about these things and not have to worry about retribution. So there's a lot of discussion going on in the world right now inside the Muslim community, and I think that's all a good thing. Again, you can't fix a problem you don't talk about. I saw a hand back there. Yes, you in the sweater. Yeah.
I don't know how to really phrase this kind of a two-part question, but the idea of being able to marry many women in some of the countries that's still legal, what was the purpose of that back in the day when that was created? And like the second kind of part of the question is like, what were the benefits to women and not to women at that time for that system? But now, how is it like misinterpreted, or is it still popular there and they're fine with it, and it's seen as bad thing in America, like vice versa? Like, how, just like you talk about the being able to marry many women?
Sure. So in older agrarian rural societies, you need to have a lot of children. There might be a lot of more women than there are men. So there are rules and reasons behind all this. There are still people who follow that idea today in America. So don't think that we're a special country that doesn't have this. There are a lot of people with multiple wives. But that did come about for a lot of different reasons. One, you needed children. Women needed to have some kind of protection, be married and do it. A woman couldn't be on her own. There was just no way to survive back then. So that led to a lot of it. There are still some places where they're allowed to have more than one wife. Usually it's up to 4 wives. Most men don't take up on that. A, they can't afford it. And a lot of countries will say, sure, you can have multiple wives, but you have to be able to afford it. They all have to be treated equally, because some of that is in the Quran. So it doesn't happen. It is not as common, but that is the reason behind it. And I would imagine most women would enjoy being in a marriage where there's another couple of wives hanging around. That would probably get pretty awkward, but there are reasons why that started. And oddly enough, I just heard there's a dead zone on radio stations between Washington, D.C. and my home in North Carolina. All you get is Christian broadcasting. So I was listening to this preacher explain that in the Bible it says you need to, multiply your family. And he was explaining that one child isn't multiplying, that's subtracting those 2 of you. And the 2 children isn't multiplying, that's only replacing what you have. And 3 children is still not multiplying. Until you have 4 kids, you haven't lived up to your Christian duty. He was going on and on about this for a couple hours. So these ideas exist around the world in different religions, and people can have these interpretations, but that's what it really comes down to. I'm going to shoot up top here, so I'll hand there. Say it again.
From a military perspective, is this administration doing a good job fighting insurgency?
Fighting against groups like ISIS?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I will. So his question is from a military perspective, has this administration done a good job fighting against groups like ISIS? No major changes to the big strategy that's been in place for quite a while now, but the big change was how much the White House gets involved with decisions on the battlefield. So now commanders at the lower levels are allowed to make decisions without having it running up to the White House, because that was the big complaint in the previous administration. Too many things were controlled in D.C. So that's been pushed back down to the lower levels. So that's really the biggest shift that has happened, and that has allowed the military to be more flexible, because they don't have to try to get, from Afghanistan, get somebody in D.C. to listen to them, change their mind, and get a decision back down. That takes time, and momentum is important in a war. So that's probably the biggest change that the military is starting to see, that I'm hearing from people that are working with it. But the strategy on a whole is still pretty much the same. Yes?
So a lot of people tend to look at Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, a lot of different religions, and say that the texts are pretty similar, and a lot of the things that are being said in the text are pretty similar, being like very, having some not so nice things to say. It's just in most Christian societies that we see right now, more Christian majority societies, those kind of atrocities aren't being committed. However, in Muslim societies, a lot of them are. Could you just explain why and when might we be able to see a reformation?
Okay, so I think most of you probably heard that question, but the texts are pretty much the same. It's the Hebrew Bible, the New Testaments, and Islam. That's one Abrahamic tradition. To Muslims, that is the same continuation, and Muhammad is the last prophet in a line of prophets. So the texts are very much the same, and you'll see that if you read the Quran. You're going to find the same stories that you've heard before you ever studied the Bible. So it comes down to interpretation, but it also comes down to the age of the religion. So Christianity, it's got 1,000 years of religious history on Islam. So Islam is the youngest of those 3 religions, and they're still going through those growing pains that every religion goes through as a religion gets older and people have discussions. So that's really what's occurring right now. I hear people throw out the word Reformation, thinking, comparing it to what happened in Christianity in these big discussions. I would say that's happening right now, especially with the power of social media, the age of Twitter, where people can talk about this anonymously. They can bring up things they don't like about how their religion is being interpreted and being taught, and they can challenge that without having somebody, come to their home and put them in jail, because there are blasphemy laws in a lot of countries. So that is all happening right now. There's a huge discussion going on worldwide, and if you could read Arabic, you'd be in on what's going on with this discussion, especially if you read Farsi. There's a lot of discussions going on in Iran right now about how religion should be interpreted. This is happening. It is in your lifetime. You're going to see a lot of changes in this. It's somebody who's watched this for 20 years. I'm stunned at how quickly it's happening now. Saudi Arabia opened movie theaters this year. Women are going to be driving to Saudi Arabia this year. There are going to be beaches where people have bikinis on in Saudi Arabia. There are some changes going on in the world that are fast, that are happening really fast for societies that were very conservative. So just keep watching. Keep watching. Yes, in the brown jacket.
What you were just saying, do you think those changes are, I know like in Dubai and Saudi Arabia, they're becoming more progressive. And, if you look at America, we are, pretty progressive in many aspects. Do you think that is from, affluence? And do you think that's what enables us to sort of take a step back? And, the rich oil countries in the Middle East, do you think that we're able to do that because, we have basic necessities and affluence, and you think that, we need to recognize that maybe that's why this isn't happening in, other places?
So your question is our affluence in America allowed us to be more progressive than other countries?
And in Saudi Arabia as well.
And I don't know if it's so much to do with affluence as it has to do with education and open dialogue. When people start talking more and people get educated more, they start challenging concepts, right? I imagine you guys have challenged a few concepts that you were taught growing up since you've been here. You're learning more about the outside world, how things work, and you're starting to challenge this concept. And as the education rates increase around the globe, you're seeing that in every country where they're learning what they've been taught by their government and by their culture, and they're comparing it to the rest of the world because now they can see it. Just like you can see the world through all the social media apps that are out there, people in parts of the world that have never seen the outside of their little closed culture are seeing it for the first time. They're comparing. And there are a lot more discussions going on. There are a lot of uncomfortable conversations at dinner tables in parts of the world that didn't used to exist. So you're going to see some of that 1960s level counter-revolution stuff going on in other parts of the world. There are going to be changes because they can have those conversations now. And I'm talking to a lot of adult Muslim families that are telling me what their kids are asking now. Where did that come from? Yeah, it's happening. I don't think it has to do with wealth as much as education and communication. That's going to be a big changing part of this. Yes, sir.
How would you describe the relationship between Israel and the neighboring Muslim states, and how much of that conflict is based on religion? And also, how would you explain the war rhetoric being used by religious leaders in the Muslim world towards Israel?
So the relationship between Israel and its Muslim neighbors, a lot of that has to do with geography more than religion. A state was created out of an area that was not at that time a state. After World War I and in World War II, when Israel was created as a state, that was a big land issue. That was a geography problem for a lot of people, and it moved a lot of folks around. So the religious angle gets used by people on both sides because religion is good at stirring people up. But it really comes down to property ownership, status of refugees, who gets to come back in, where does this go? Where do the borders extend of Israel? There are hardliners who want it to go even farther in than it is. There are people who say all of that land is stolen, you need to give it all back and shut down the country. So it is not so much about religion as it is about geography. It's land ownership, and who has control over it. But people tie it to religion, and they make it a very religious thing. It's a holy place for three major religions. That's going to be sensitive. So it always gets tied back to that, and people use that as they need to kind of rile up their base in their countries. So they're not looking at maybe some of the corruption going on in their country. They'll say, but look at what's happening to those people. We've really got to look at this. It just gets misused. It's a political football. Good way to think about it. And there are solutions out there. They're hard to get to because it's so politically wrapped up in helping other countries. Yeah. Yes?
You talk about ISIS and stuff being outlaws, like Islam and stuff. But at what point does someone who interprets the Quran in such an extreme way get forced out of it? And is it fair to tell someone like ISIS that that's not Islam, that's not what Islam is, but it's their interpretation of it? So do you think it's fair to cast them out of their religion if they believe that's what it really is?
I don't think you can cast anybody out of a religion. Religion is your personal belief. So, if you ask a guy in ISIS who is religious, and they're not all very religious people, there are 15 different reasons why people get recruited in groups like ISIS. they're going to tell you they are the perfect Muslim and they are doing everything by the book. You're never going to convince them that they're outside. The real trick is to convince people that may be persuaded to join groups like ISIS and commit atrocities, and start slavery and crucifixions, It's segregating them from that idea that, that ideology goes too far. What they think is wrong. And here's other proof in the Quran that says these guys have kind of left the farm. And there are extremists in every religion. What religion is committing atrocities in Myanmar right now? Who's throwing children and women on bonfires? Buddhists. So every religion can have, these extremists, and the mainstream of that religion is going to look at them and go, that's not what we're taught. That is not Buddhism. We don't do that. So it's not about really, physically saying you're no longer in the religion, get off the boat. You really can't do that. But it's about having that conversation to show people you can go too far in any religion, and we need to be aware of that. So, yes.
Complex question, but so if you have someone who goes and joins ISIS and they live that culture and eventually want to come back to America with their friends, how would, and that is a question that's being discussed a lot, but how do you go about that, accepting them back into the culture where they came from?
So two ways to think about that. If somebody's gone over and joined ISIS and realized that they were being lied to, it was all fraud, and they don't want anything to do with it, they want to go back to their normal life, that's one type of person. You would treat them differently. You're going to want to, oh great, you saw the light, you've seen the error of your ways. Here's your punishment, but we want to get you back in society so you can tell other people, because you're going to be someone who can say, those guys, they are gone. They are really out there. Problem with that, most people that come to that conclusion don't get out of ISIS. They kill deserters like that. They don't want you to get out and explain that it was all a lie. And then you've got the folks that are just leaving because they know that they're losing their territory. Syria and Iraq are not going to be a place where they can live. So they want to sneak back to wherever country they came from so they can continue their fight wherever they go. So those you have to treat differently. You hope you know who they are. And we do a pretty good job of tracking down most of the people that get in there. And then you've got to watch them. Wait for them to if they haven't already committed crimes that you can charge them for while they were with ISIS, now you've got to watch them again to make sure they're not committing crimes or recruiting other people or sending other folks to join the next ISIS. So two different ways to think about it. Does that kind of help out? Neither one are easy to do and takes a lot of resources. This is resource-intensive work, and frankly, we don't have the resources to do that very well. We haven't invested in that in our nations, so that's a tough one.
It's sort of a heavy question, but agencies like the NSA and that are doing a good job of tracking people down. ISIS is spreading not just from those 4 or 5, 7 predominantly Muslim countries to Europe, even America. How do you? I guess what I'm trying to ask is do you think that we're moving in the direction where first world countries are going to have to accept that we have to give up some of our personal freedom and privacy to keep us safe from radical terrorism? Or do you think that it is going in the other way and you'll still be able to keep those freedoms?
I think we're right in the middle right now. We'll see how it goes. We do have a lot of resources to keep an eye on people coming back. We don't have enough. And so there's always this fine balance. That's something I'll talk about in counterterrorism policy tomorrow night. There's always a fine balance in how much you can be restrictive without trampling your own people's rights. That's a tricky issue. Every country is different. Not every country has the same rights that we have in our country. So that's different everywhere you go. And so somebody can get into Germany, and now they get better access to America because Germany has a different policy and agreement than we do. So it gets tricky as people pass through countries. And the bad guys know this. They know where to move and how to get around this. They know where the loopholes are because they're pretty glaring, and we're public. Most democracies in the world have public constitutions and laws, and you know where the loopholes are. And people work around them. So there will be some laws. I think there always is. Every generation, there's something else that just isn't done. If you listen to songs today that were on the radio in the 80s, they're all edited now. There are words we used in the 80s in rock and roll and pop music that your generation would recoil to hear those words. So we edit those words now on those 80s songs when they're played on the modern radio. He doesn't even know what radio is? I'm sorry. When you have that thing in your car and you turn the radio? So, yeah, it's tough. We're going to lose some, for sure. Yes?
Does the culture and the religion allow for assimilation, or is it difficult? Because you see the Muslim populations in like south of France and London, in Minnesota, assimilation seems to be difficult, or they're reluctant to assimilate, or they just flat out refuse and then make demands that their host countries meet their needs. Is it inherent in the religion and the culture, or is it something else?
I think on the assimilation issue, and it's different again in every country you go to. I was in Paris last year. I saw the massive inability to assimilate. Part of that is on the Parisians and the French culture. They didn't want anybody else to join, so that makes it even harder. So it depends on where they move to. It depends on if they move in a large family, if they move to an enclave where there are them. Has anybody been to any of our major cities that have a Chinatown? Are you still hearing Chinese on the streets constantly? I mean, sometimes it just takes a long time for people to shift to the culture in which they're in, to pick up the language, to pick up all the ways of life and how you get married and how you do your faith, all those things. I mean, it takes time. It takes generations. So my great-grandfather only spoke French, and he had been here for a long time. So this happens. There's nothing in Islam that says you can't do that. There are people who will try to find an interpretation and use a verse or misuse it to say that is a rule and you need to stick to it. Those are the real hardliners that don't want assimilation. But there's nothing in there that precludes you to assimilate it. Some of my best friends are more assimilated to this culture than I am sometimes, and they're Muslim, and they came here at different time periods, at different parts of the country. So I really think it goes to how you've been raised at home, what you're taught in your mosque, where you go, what you study. And every religion kind of goes through that, every culture that comes here. But there are little enclaves in our country of every different culture, and they still exist. There are compounds in Colorado that are offshoots of the Mormon religion that federal law enforcement can't get into. They actually are walled-off compounds and have their own police force, and they do not assimilate with their local society. And there is people with 15 brides in there, and we still haven't figured that out. So I think it really comes down to interpretation of religion and how you want to, what your goals are in the end. All right. Yeah.
What do you think the best way to raise awareness about the subject is? Not everyone has translated the Quran themselves. So, is it through videos? Is it through dialogue, news, music? What's the best way to share the message that it's just a religion, it's not peace, it's not war, it's just a religion?
I think it's all of the above because people learn in different ways. I think the biggest part is getting over the stigma that you can't talk about it. And that's what the biggest problem was. If you watch after September 11th, and this is what I've been watching as I've spent my career looking at the Middle East and looking at Islamic cultures and studying and talking with friends who are Muslim all those years. After September 11th, the Bush administration really didn't talk about Islam. The Obama administration really didn't talk about Islam. It wasn't until the 2016 election where this became the topic that everybody had to talk about. But look where we were in that discussion by 2016. 15 years after September 11th, it was an angry discussion about Islam. So I think the biggest hurdle to overcome is just to say it's okay to talk about religion. We need more interfaith dialogue. We should have people talking about religion more often. It shouldn't be a taboo subject that you can't talk about. And believe me, I have realized that some people still strongly believe it's a taboo subject, and you should not talk about it. Let's just say, there are some violent people out there that have no problem telling you what they want to do to you. There are people who think you shouldn't talk about any religion, especially this religion, and I don't think that helps anything. So that's the first hurdle, and then you talk about it in every medium you possibly can, and allow Muslims to have that conversation too. And they are, but allow them to speak. And if you hear somebody saying it in a clear way, amplify their voice. That's the other big ticket. If you hear somebody talking about it in a logical way that's not creating more hatred, amplify their voices. Share what they're saying. Share that message. Get people to listen to that message. I think that's part of it. Does that help? Yeah. All right. Yeah.
How do you engage in dialogue about things such as Islamophobia with people who don't want to engage in dialogue? Like people have made up their minds about how awful Islam is.
two things on that. I don't like the word Islamophobia because that's a word that people like to throw around to censor other people. Are there people who hate all Muslims? Yes. If you label them all as Islamophobics, then the conversation ends. You can't walk into a room and say, you people are all Islamophobic, I'm going to change your mind. That's not going to happen. I mean, you literally are walking and calling everybody a bigot and then saying, but let me enlighten you. So I think it has to be an open discussion where people talk. I talk in some audiences where literally, I made the mistake of having a beard. I grow a pretty good beard from working in the Middle East a lot. I learned how to get my beard pretty good. I was really scared to get out in the parking lot after that one. I had the pastor walk me out. So I go to some audiences that do not think there's anything good about the religion of Islam or any Muslim person. And you're going to change 50% of their minds, but I find the easiest way to do it is just to have a discussion and take their questions, lay out a few facts, but don't get in their face and say, I got to fix all you racists. You don't know what you're talking about. Because that shuts the whole conversation down right there. You're done. No one's ever listening. And that's the big problem in our interfaith dialogue system. You get people who get on stage and just pretty much cast the reverse stereotype on everybody who isn't Muslim and say, well, you all are all idiots and you're all bigots and I'll enlighten you now. It just doesn't work. You have to be willing to hear people give and take, explain things. I teach classes everywhere. I teach community college. I teach in the military. I teach in the intelligence community. And just have these discussions over and over again. I have people take my classes 2 or 3 times because they're really great. And then, maybe after a couple of sessions, they'll come up and go, you actually changed my...
And also, do you think that, what's the best way for the government to go about deciphering how to, protect us against those things while at the same time being respectful of people who are peaceful?
First, it comes down to using the right language. And then you have to explain what you're doing. The ban that was in place in that executive order, that was probably the worst selling of any kind of new law change I've ever seen. It was all based on information that had been collected during the previous administration and was studied and looked at and developed and then launched in the most horrible way. It was like the Titanic sinking as soon as it went off the port. You've got to be smart about how you talk about anything. And that was going to be controversial. It was something that was already in play in the U.S. government. They just enacted it and did it poorly. So, you've got to explain it the right way, use the right words. It's all about education in the end. If you can't explain it in a simple way that people understand, here are the facts. These are why these countries are dangerous to us. They have a huge problem with keeping track of terrorists. That's going to be a problem for us. Explain it in a way that people get it. So, was there a second part of your question?
Oh, yeah. How can we go about
Gotcha. So the best way for the government to do that. Again, be open, be transparent, have these conversations before you do it. Make sure that you've talked to all your partners that are going to be affected by that. You just can't do things on the fly. You can't do things quickly. You have to study, prepare people. You have to prepare the audience for your message. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you're telling them. Tell them what you told them. You've got to prepare these things. It's like teaching a class. You're not going to get it if you just throw it on the table and go, that's the new thing. People react in every which way, and it's usually not pretty, so preparation. Yeah?
One more question.
One more? Right here.
And so I'm not sure if you mentioned this, after you both but at what point did you open yourself and the people around you up to criticism and those sorts of things when you began to dive into the religion and everything that sort of the case did? I think exactly right.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize or decide that, okay, this is something that is bigger than myself and that I'm ready to face what is to come to me when I speak about this?
I had been talking about this pretty much my whole time in the military. I deployed into the Middle East in 1996 when we first started dating, and I started learning more about Islam. So we trained side by side with a Muslim Special Forces unit and lived in the desert with them and ate with them. And, I learned a whole, as a Baptist kid from New England, I learned a lot about another religion. So I really dove into it and started talking about it my whole career. And I became an advisor and kind of a Middle East specialist within the Army. And I advised a lot of different generals and ambassadors on how to do this. And started advising, the last administration after I retired, sending them information, getting them to think about it, and be more open about it. And their refusal to talk about it really hit me. I was like, you were in the perfect position to talk about this. People will listen to you. You know, you have a great approval rating as a president. Like, if you can't deliver this message and start talking about education, no one can. I started talking about it, and I realized how much America didn't know about Islam, and how much I knew, and you know, kind of talked about that with my wife. I can explain this to people. People can get it when I talk to them about it, and I can change minds. So it's kind of worth the risk for me. And I had so many good Muslim friends who I saw do amazing things inside our government and other countries. You know, people who saved my life, saved my friends' lives. So many of my friends were working to get visas straight for their interpreters and bring them back from Iraq and Afghanistan. I've got a buddy in D.C. right now that is a retired Green Beret, and he spends his time at church preparing teams to go out and help the Muslim refugees to integrate into the D.C. area so that they do assimilate, so that they understand the culture, so that they understand how the system works. You know, there's a lot of veterans who are working on this issue because we work beside Muslim partners inside our government and outside. You know, our classmates, our buddies, our friends in our rifle squads, we're different religions. And you don't worry about that in war. It's not important. So we all wanted to kind of step up. And I think after I retired, I just realized I could do it. So why not? It's better than fishing.
Let's thank